Hey guys, it's Discerning Dad 73. You might also just call me by my first name, Nate. Welcome to this first video in a series of videos that I want to do on angels, Nephilim, giants, etc., entitled Angels Who Sinned. And that is a phrase taken from 2 Peter chapter 2. And we'll see that a little further down into the video with that reference. But angels who sinned, it's a fascinating topic. It's a topic that many people have been studying in the recent years, arguing over even, but I want to take a stab at this in my studies over the last year, especially pertaining to angels, the sons of God, the Nephilim. So many people are asking, well, what's the truth about these topics? What's the truth about Genesis chapter 6? And the events that are recorded in verses 1 through 4, which speak about the sons of God. Some believe are angels, some believe are men. And of course, their offspring, the Nephilim, are mentioned. Some versions, such as the King James Version, just come right out and call them giants, which is fascinating. Well, the traditional view goes something like this, and this is a view that for most of my years in study I held to. Number one, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the sons of God are said to be the righteous line of Seth, or of the righteous line of Seth. That is spoken about at the end of chapter 4. In which men began to, quote, call upon the name of the Lord. And in that same section of Scripture, the daughters of men are said to be the unrighteous daughters of the line of Cain. And of course, we do know that Cain was evil and he slew his brother Abel, and the blood of Abel did cry out from the ground. And so the rationale here is that angels mating with women is just too bizarre. So therefore it had to be the sons of God, who were the righteous line of Seth, and the daughters of men, who were the unrighteous line of Cain. Well, let's go ahead and look at these scriptures, and we'll look at these again near the end of the video. But first, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took with them wives of all which they chose. So here, the sons of God in the traditional view would be the righteous line of Seth. But notice that the word or name Seth is nowhere to be found in this context, especially in Genesis chapter 6, in the context in which they purport. Also, notice how there is no mention of the daughters of Cain here. In fact, as we'll see in just a moment, when you dive into the Old Testament and look at all of the occurrences of this designation of the sons of God, it always refers to angels, and we'll get there in just a moment. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And of course, the emphasis here in these verses are mine, to point out some of the words and phrases that are important to our study and to our context. And again, notice that there seems to be a distinction between sons of God and children or daughters of men. Notice how men seems to indicate of all men, not just one particular group of daughters of men, such as from an unrighteous lineage of Cain. In fact, we know the rules of Bible study tell us that to insert Seth or Cain here, when it's not in the context, is actually not appropriate. And we shouldn't be adding things into the text that aren't there. Job chapter 1, verse 6 is one of the several instances in the Old Testament in which the designation that we've discovered in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, is actually mentioned. It says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them." Also in Job chapter 2, verse 1. "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord." Again in Job 38, 4 through 7. And this verse really clarifies some things for us. Of course, God is answering Job and questioning Job, and he says, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And he talks about the measures of it and the line that was stretched upon it, the foundations. He says, "Who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." And so here we have in context a very important piece of information which tells us that the sons of God were present during the creation of the foundations of the earth. This is before humans are even created. So when we look at these scriptures, these several mentions in the Old Testament, particularly in Genesis and Job, we see that every time this designation, the sons of God, are used, is always referring to angels, the created spiritual beings in heaven, created by God, are sometimes also referred to as his children or heaven's children. Now 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 through 6 is where I get the title of this video lesson, Angels Who Sinned. So we're going to look at this verse, and I think that this verse is enough to help us to understand who exactly were the sons of God in Genesis 6. But if that doesn't do it for you, we've got a smoking gun in a couple other verses as well. But let's consider 2 Peter 2 verses 4 through 6 first. And it tells us, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly." So a couple of interesting things here. In the past, when I read this verse, and many people read the beginning of this verse, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned," many people will say, well, those are the angels that the tail of the dragon swung out of heaven, the third of the angels mentioned in Revelation. And we'll automatically assume that those were the angels that sinned by joining Satan. But we're going to find out in context that this is a different set of angels. Of course, the angels that left heaven sinned, but these next few verses are going to show us in context that the angels that sinned here are being spoken of in a very specific format. And notice the connection here in verse 5, "and spared not the old world, but saved Noah." Well, that is a reference to Genesis 6 and following, in which we began this video. And then also notice the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are brought into the mix here as an example of those who sinned and were condemned. So here you have the angels that sinned, you have the men of the old world that sinned prior to the flood, and then you have another example of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these are all examples that are taken together. Now, if that doesn't convince you, I believe the next few verses are a smoking gun. Excuse me. Let's consider Jude chapter 1, verses 6 through 7. "And the angels, which kept not their first estate," that is, their dominion, we know that to be in heaven, "but left their own habitation," and we're going to talk about this word, which underlies the meaning of habitation, "he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." So these angels who left their first estate and their own habitation were reserved in everlasting chains unto judgment or final judgment of the great day. Same angels that were spoken of when we considered 2 Peter 2, verses 4 through 6. Continuing in verse 7, even as Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities about them, in like manner, and this is important, it's speaking of the angels who in like manner, just as, or even as, Sodom and Gomorrah, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So this is quite a smoking gun verse because it connects these angels who sin from 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, and Jude 1, 6 through 7. It connects them back to the situation that we read about in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And notice that it says, even as. So these angels, these created heavenly beings, sinned even as, or in the like manner, of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them. Notice it talks about a sexual sin. It is a fleshly fornication and going after strange flesh, which is another way of saying this was not the will of God. This was an abomination. And it says that all of these groups here, the angels, Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities around Sodom and Gomorrah, are an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And so I really consider this to be quite a smoking gun here. If we take another look at Jude chapter 6, 1 verse 6, I have included here the Greek word that underlies this word habitation. It is oikoterion. And you may recognize that word if you ever took any Greek from the word oikos or oikos, which means house in general. It says the oikoterion for habitation. Now, why is that important? Well, let's look at another scripture that I believe is another smoking gun and really shed some light on this situation. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house, oikoterion, which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. So interesting context here as Paul is speaking to the Corinthians. He's not talking about a physical building that you dwell in. He's talking about the house or dwelling place, the tabernacle, the oikoterion of our bodies. Oikoterion in the Strong's, number 3613, a dwelling place, habitation, and notice this, of the body, as a dwelling place of the spirit. So again, here's another smoking gun, which is telling us that Paul is using the same word that is used in Jude and is also used in the Genesis account, at least as far as the idea of leaving these sons of God. This is quite a powerful testimony from the scriptures itself. But we're also going to look at a few other testimonies as well to give some additional information here. So consider the book of Enoch. Now I know most people do not believe that Enoch is considered canon or should be in the canon, although we do know that the Ethiopian scriptures have included and have historically included the book of Enoch. But it synchronizes with some accounts in Genesis and appears to give us even more detail about the angels that sinned from 2 Peter 2 verse 4. So it's certainly worth investigating. And you know, we often cite many non-canonical sources in our biblical studies that corroborate Scripture. So why not the book of Enoch? For example, the testimony of his Jewish historian who also collaborated with the Romans, Flavius Josephus. And he says, for many angels of God coupled with women and begat sons that proved unjust. And it talks about just their evil attitude and also their strength, and even makes a connection here to the Greek mythological figures. So this is quite an interesting testimony. Well, what about the testimony of Tertullian, who is quote unquote an early church father? He speaks about angels as having fallen from God, and he talks about the concupiscence or sexual relations with females. And he also speaks of the human lust which such angels yearned after. So this is quite an interesting testimony here. And of course here he talks about the sons of God, and he says, wedded to angels. So here is a second quote from Tertullian. Well, let's consider just a short passage from the book of Enoch. That's the first Enoch, section 1, chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, the first part of 3. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. Then continuing, and it speaks of Semyaza, who was their leader, and it said that he was fearing to do this deed. He knew that there would be this penalty of great sin, and he was in a sense afraid that these other angels would crawfish on the deal. But they said, Let us all swear an oath and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Notice in verse 6 it says, And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And so this is quite a fascinating testimony that seems to not only corroborate Genesis 6 and some of these other scriptures such as Jude and 2 Peter, but it also seems to flesh out some information. And this is just a few little entries from the book of Enoch. In successive videos, we'll look at a little bit more of some potential testimony from the book of Enoch here. Well, you may have heard also of the book of Jubilees. Some people call it Little Genesis. And here's a little bit of information about it in a translation by R.H. Charles. And this is some information from a website from truefreethinker.com. But he says on the website, we will pick up at the mention of Jared, whose name means descent. And that's interesting when you consider what Enoch said about the 200 watcher class angels descending from heaven upon Mount Hermon. Continuing, For in his days the angels of the Lord descended upon the earth, those who are named the Watchers. And of course it mentions Jared and his offspring Enoch. It says he testified to the Watchers who had sinned, the angels who had sinned, with the daughters of men, very specific. For these had begun to unite themselves so as to be defiled with the daughters of men, and Enoch testified against them all. Well, quickly, let's look at a few other scriptures from Daniel. Daniel chapter 4, verse 13. Daniel speaks of, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher, an holy one, came down from heaven. Daniel 4:17. His matter, speaking of the king Nebuchadnezzar, by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones. So this is the decree against Nebuchadnezzar, and notice how it uses the terms again, watchers and holy ones. Verse 23 of Daniel chapter 4. Whereas the king, that's Nebuchadnezzar, saw a watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven. In this vision here. So again, watcher is mentioned again, the same word that is mentioned in the book of Enoch. Very interesting. Also, consider in other scriptures in the Old Testament, angels who were called men. In Genesis 18, 1 through 21, 3 men visit Abram and Sarai to talk with him about the fact that Sarai would conceive in her old age a child of promise. And notice that Abram believes these are men. In fact, they are angels, but they are in the form of men, and they even eat food with them. Genesis 19, 1 through 22. Two men, whom we know by context are angels, visit Lot and his family and interact as men. Judges 6, 11 through 22. Gideon speaks with a man whom later he realizes was an angel. Judges 13, 2 through 21. Manoah did not realize at first that the man of God that he was speaking with was in fact an angel. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is quite a list of occurrences in Scripture, in the Old Testament particularly, where angels appeared and interacted with humans as men. So can angels transform themselves, take the form of men, and even eat meals and touch human flesh? Yes, according to Scriptures, they can. And I've heard some people say in various studies that, well, they could only do that with the permission of the Lord when they were on official business. But that is a tradition of man. That is not actually found in Scripture. We see all through Scripture where they are able to take the form of men. So consider that in your studies. Well, let's go back now to the first two scriptures that we looked at. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. So, our conclusion: the angels who sinned, as we began this video from 2 Peter 2:4, were in fact the sons of God, mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. That's comparing Scripture with Scripture and in the appropriate context. So part 2 will be coming very soon. I hope to have a new upload next week, and we'll continue our study on the angels who sinned. Part 2 will be the offspring of angels. We're going to look into Genesis 6 again and branch out from there and look at the byproduct, the offspring of the sons of God mating with the daughters of men, the Nephilim, or giants. So I want to thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share. And if you need to contact me, you can message me at discerningdad73@gmail.com. Take care and God bless.